Hey guys, it's Courtney. Today I'm going to be using a few products from WPlus 9. I'm going to be using the My Whole Life stamp set, the Ironworks background die, and the Mother sentiment from the Embroidered Bouquet Editions stamp set, which I believe now is discontinued, but you can either skip it or use something else. So I'm going to start off with my stamping, and I have a scrap piece of paper here just to line up my stamp. Starting with the outline and just stamping that with any ink. I'm just using a black ink just for placement reasons alone. Next, I'm going to take the second step, I guess, of the particular image, line that up on that scrap piece of paper, and then take a square piece of Nina Solar White, and I'm going to stamp this with Duckling ink by Simon Says Stamp. And I'm going to stamp this 4 times. So I'm using a square so that it's positioned in the exact same spot each and every time. And I'm just rotating this counterclockwise each time so that my image is in the same exact spot each and every time. Next, bringing out that scrap piece again to line up the third step, I guess, of this layering stamp right onto that first image. This time I'm going to be stamping it with apricot ink, also by Simon. I'm using all Simon Says Stamp inks here. Then I'll bring out that square panel there and stamp 4 times again, rotating it each and every time counterclockwise 1 time so that again it's lined up for each one of my images. Once that is done, I'm going to go ahead and put that aside, and we'll move on to the second image, which is another flower. And I'm going to bring out that scrap piece of paper again and just use a different corner. Doesn't really matter which corner that you use. Going to bring out the outline first, stamp that with the black ink for placement purposes only. Clean that off and bring in the step 2, or the fill-in stamp, I guess, the solid stamp. And this time I'm going to be stamping this with Twirling Tutu, stamping that onto my scrap piece of paper, and then I'll bring out another square piece of that Nina and stamp that in all 4 sides again. And I'm going to speed this up because I did the same thing with all 3 flowers that I'm going to be using, as well as the leaves. There's just not as many steps to the leaves. Once that first layer was down, I'm going to move on to the second layer and stamp with Hollyhock ink, which is just a little bit darker of a pink. And this is for the centers of the flower. So I'm going to stamp that on all 4 and then move on to the third flower that we're going to be using. And I'm going to be using Melon ink and Coral Reef. And for the leaves, like I said, these are pretty much solid. There's not too many layers to them. I'm going to be using Jelly Bean ink. Now this entire card, I didn't pick up 1 marker, 1 pencil, 1 paintbrush, no nothing. This is just pretty much stamping and die cutting. So this is not something I typically do. It's kind of how I started off, as far as just stamping and die cutting and things like that. So it was kind of fun to kind of go back to that without having to worry to color anything really intricately or anything like that. I kind of just had fun with it. So as you can see, I am just finishing up this third flower here, and then we'll move on to the leaves. Now, if you guys joined me in my live about a week and a half ago with Jen, I mentioned that occasionally I will be giving away the stamp set that I use in the video. So today is that day. I'm going to be giving out the My Whole Life stamp set by WPlus 9. All you have to do is comment below, and I'll pick a winner, let's say May 4th. That way it'll give you guys a couple of days. Now keep in mind, it's the stamp set that I am using today, so it is going to be used. I've only used it once, but I can mail that out to you. Whoever the winner will be, I'll announce it in a video on May 4th. All right, so I am just finishing up the leaves here, and like I said, these are solid. And the next step in the process is to restamp that outline, but this time I want this outline to be embossed. So I'm going to take out that scrap piece of paper again, and I'm going to bring out the outline image and line that up directly over where I had stamped previously. And I'm just using this scrap paper as placement only. Going to bring out that square cardstock here, treat that with my anti-static tool, and then stamp this image, or this outline image, 4 times with my Versamark ink. Now, your ink that we stamped the flowers with initially, they're colored inks, needs to be completely dry. Even though this is a dye ink and it dries to the touch immediately, the paper is not completely dry. So I apparently did not wait long enough. I sprinkled on gold embossing powder by Ranger, and I had a whole lot of embossing powder sticking to areas that I didn't want it to be. So I was able to brush most of it away with a dry paintbrush before bringing in my heat tool. I'm okay with a few specks here and there because it kind of adds a little interest to these images, being they aren't perfect. They don't line up perfectly, which I kind of like. But I have learned my lesson. So before I heat emboss any of the other panels or any of the other images that we had already stamped out, I'm going to test them first. So once this was heat set with my heat gun here, and I did make sure my heat gun was heated up before bringing it to the paper, I'm going to take another one of those panels, and without stamping, I'm just going to sprinkle on a little bit of that embossing powder, that gold embossing powder, to see if it sticks to the image in places that shouldn't stick. It actually shouldn't stick at all. I don't have any Versamark down, but it did. It stuck to the centers where I had that second layer. So I'm going to put these aside a little bit longer to dry. Next, I'm going to run the Ironworks background die through my Gemini with a piece of Nina Solar White 80-pound cardstock, and I'm just going to poke out those little areas that didn't all the way cut through, and we're going to go ahead and stamp our sentiment. So I'm going to take the Mother sentiment from the Embroidered Bouquet Edition stamp set, as well as part of the sentiment from the My Whole Life stamp set. So here I'm just kind of lining everything up to make sure that it is going to fit into that circle, and it actually fits perfectly. So I'm going to, again, treat this with my anti-static tool. And then first I'm going to stamp out that Mother with my Versamark ink. And I am going to sprinkle on the gold embossing powder, but I'm not going to heat set it yet. I'm only sprinkling on the embossing powder so that I can see where I stamped, because obviously the Versamark is clear. And for placement reasons, I need to know where that word is. So being I only want a portion, I can't speak today, a portion of that main sentiment to be on my front card or the main panel there, I masked out the bottom portion with a piece of Post-it note tape, inked the first part of the sentiment up with Versamark, stamped that directly under that Mother, sprinkled on some more gold embossing powder, and just brushed away any stray embossing powder I had that was kind of stuck to the grooves within that die, and then went ahead and heat set that. Next, I'm going to go ahead and adhere this down to my A2 size note card, and I'm using my Tombow Mono Multi Glue to put glue basically all over the back. This is best to probably use wet glue for this particular die, and I put it everywhere, including the center of that circle, just because I don't want any of these areas to raise up. So I'm going to go ahead and carefully adhere this down to my card panel, and this is the exact size of an A2 size card, so it fits perfectly on the card base. I did have one little side there to the right that was kind of lifting up. I don't know whether I had any glue there, but I just lifted that up and squeezed a little dot there and adhered that down. Now I did have a little bit of glue that squished out, but we'll fix that in a little bit. I want to make sure that glue is completely dry before we do that. So next, I'm going to go ahead and bring back out my Misty. I think everything has sat long enough where that ink is completely dry, and I'm going to do this process all over again for the rest of my images. Go ahead and line up that outline on my scrap piece of paper, bring out my main images, stamp that 4 times after treating it with my anti-static tool, stamping that 4 times with the Versamark ink, and then sprinkling on that gold embossing powder. Now, when you rotate your paper, you want to make sure that you're rotating it the same way each and every time, especially when you're stamping with the Versamark. You can't see where you stamped. So you just want to make sure that whether you go clockwise or counterclockwise, you kind of do that every single time so that you can keep track. So I went ahead and did that same thing as far as the outline stamp for all 4 of the images, or the remaining 3 of the images that we are going to use in the card. Sprinkled those all with gold embossing powder and then heat set those, making sure that that heat gun was fully heated up before bringing it to the paper to avoid as much warping as I possibly can. Once everything was done as far as the stamping goes, I went ahead and die cut all of these images. So I'm going to take an adhesive eraser to kind of fix up some of those areas where my glue kind of squirted out. It is now perfectly dry, but it is still a little sticky. And you know, when glue gets sticky, it gets dirty looking, and I don't want that. So I'm just lightly going over that with an adhesive eraser to get that off. And then I'm going to take some of my flowers and leaves, and I'm just kind of placing them on my card panel first before adhering anything down, so that I can kind of tell what my placement will be before I stick anything down permanently. So originally I was only going to put this on the bottom portion, bottom left of this little circle here, and it looked a little bit too plain. So I ended up adding some more of the images on top as well, pretty much the same way as I did on the bottom, but I felt like this kind of filled in that blank space up there. Once I was happy with the placement, I went ahead and adhered everything down. I started with my middle flower, that pink flower there, and I adhered this one down flat with my Tombow Mono multi-glue, and then I'm going to pop up the remaining flowers. And the leaves, for the most part, all I kind of do with those is kind of tuck them in wherever I can, making sure that this doesn't hang off the edge of the card. Being this die is the size of an A2 size card, I don't want anything hanging off of it. Otherwise, it's going to get stuck. It's going to get bent in an envelope. So once I had my foam tape down, I'm kind of fill in those little leaves there, and I'm just going to kind of lift up the corners and just add a little tiny dot of my wet glue to make sure that those stick down. And then I can also kind of fit them underneath or on top of the foam tape, depending on if you want them popped up or not. So as long as you don't press that foam tape down too hard, or that image that has the foam tape down too hard, you should be able to kind of lift that up a little bit and squeeze one of those leaves underneath. So once the bottom part was done, I did the same exact thing for the top, and then we'll move on to the inside of the card. Now we had already used the beginning part, I guess, of that main sentiment there. So I wanted to put the remaining part in the inside. So here's where I screwed up, but it isn't too bad. It's easily fixable. I am going to use that masking technique again because I only want the second portion of that sentiment. So I'm going to make sure that my stamp is really nice and clean from that Versamark. Mask that out with some more Post-it note tape. And I'm going to ink this up with Simon Says Stamp Dye Black ink. This gives a really, really nice crisp image. Then remove the Post-it note tape and stamp that on the inside. However, this is where I noticed I masked out the wrong part. I masked out the bottom. I don't want to mask out the bottom. So I had to make sure that that was really nice and clean again, and just basically do the opposite. Except for this time, after I ink up my stamp, I'm going to remove the Post-it note tape and add a little bit more, just because I don't trust myself that that stamp is 100% clean, and this will avoid any kind of smudges that you may get. But that is it. I'm going to go ahead and stamp that right in the center, and that is the card for today, guys. Thanks a lot for stopping by, and have a great day.